make sure this is on for the recording, what I learned from my yard this summer. Quick show of hands, how many of you were here June 11th? Anybody remember back that far? That was actually the last time I was in this pulpit preaching. So I have this luxury, as most ministers do, at least in the Unitarian Universalism, that we have sort of a summer that's a little bit more relaxed. I didn't do any sermons between June 11th and I was at Open Circle last week, but this is my first one here since then. And so we spend the time, it's a combination of study leave and vacation, frankly. And the study leave, it's the time where I finally actually could read a book or do some things, and that it's not that immediate every week produce a sermon kind of thing. And I do a lot of pre-planning. As you may or may not know if you're a visitor, we are a consortium of 3 congregations, all with their separate programming, and a lot of it I'm the one, we have no staff, so I tend to be the one that manages the programming in a huge collaboration with lots and lots of wonderful people. So that takes time. So I spend a lot of time with that, and I just thought I'd start with explaining that. First of all, it's wonderful that I have it, and second of all, it's wonderful that my 3 congregations are generous enough to give me that. So it started back in the 3rd week of June I was your representative, your only delegate for the 3 congregations at the Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly. We meet every year, it's about 4,000 people, and it's a governing body, actually. It's a democratically run denomination. And it also is filled with fantastic speakers and paid musicians who are absolutely fabulous. And usually I sign up and sing in the choir, which if you go out, I sent in my newsletter, I think a month or 2 ago, a link where you can see my little head bobbing around. I was actually wearing the same shirt. It's just fabulous, and the music director is just marvelous. So it's just, for me, it just recharges my batteries, and I just love it so much. While we were there, just to give you an update, we elected a new president, Reverend Dr. Sophia Benecourt, very talented, amazing woman. And then we voted to keep moving forward on the reworking of how we present our principles, values, and sources to the world. You know them as our 7 principles and 6 sources, and it's just sort of morphing into a new way, and I will be talking a little bit about that today. I took a refresher course on healthy boundary setting, which was good. During the summer, I do my annual commitments to preach at the Appleton Fellowship and the Door County Fellowship. I officiated a couple emotionally difficult memorial services for dear loved ones who struggled mightily with addiction. And then I read a book. I actually read a book for fun in the summer. And this was by the psychology researcher, Dr. Lisa Miller. I'm not sure if anybody has heard of her, but she wrote this book called The Awakened Brain, The New Science of Spirituality and Our Quest for an Inspired Life. And I'm like, if that isn't a UU book, I don't know what is. So stay tuned. There's going to be a sermon or at least a book group on that one. I was telling some people before the service, I binge watched all 6 episodes of The Vikings on Netflix. For those of you that aren't familiar, it's set in the 9th century with a Scandinavian Vikings invasion of England, France, and other lands. Essentially, the premise of the whole series is when the last pagan outpost in Northern Europe confronted Christianity. So it was a huge period of transition in Europe, and this is, you know, you watch it, it's like Game of Thrones, you watch it for the gore and the battles and the interesting intrigue and all that kind of stuff. But about every 3rd episode, there'd be this surprising and remarkable theological discussion juxtaposing Norse paganism and Christianity. I'm like, oh, look at that, look at that. Of course, my partner's like, ugh. But I really got into it. And then, of course, the gore and mayhem and all that, I'd go like this, and I'd go, tell me when it's over, often. So, you know, I watch shows with different purposes, I guess. Made a few short trips to Milwaukee, Chicago, and the driftless region of western Wisconsin and Door County, and accumulated, I'm going to give a plug here, 4 days of vacation in the beginning of August from Mile of Music in Appleton. music is everywhere, every corner, every venue. It's all free, and it's all artists that are doing original work. So that's the thing about it. So we take vacation just to do that. And, it's like going on vacation in Nashville without going home. I mean, without having to leave home. So I actually tapped into a few artists. I took notes. I'm like, ooh, go buy their album. That'd be a great recording for something during the service. So again, I'm very grateful that ministers have this time, and it's time to recharge and your generosity. So my last sermon was on June 11th, so we'll just open it up on the floor and let people tell me what I preached back then. I don't expect anybody to remember. It was called Delight Your Spirit This Summer, Centered in Love, and the theme for June was delight. And so it opened with a list of delights from the Reverend Scott Taylor, who is the founder and basically co-creator of all the Soul Matters materials, which we use in our RE program, which we use in our Chalice Circle program extensively. And I kind of went on from his list and pointed that each delight, and I'm spiritual delight. Let me define that for a second. To me, it's those things that are usually memories that take you back to a moment and instantly transcend you to someplace else, even if just for a second, makes you smile. I went on to highlight that each of his was centered in some kind of love. And then I related it to the writings of Dr. Brene Brown and Bell Hooks. And then I ended with a challenge for us to all consider our principles and values and how we would center them always in love. Now a bit of confession. That sermon was very academic. It was one of those rookie mistakes where I'd found all these really cool resources and I wanted to share them all with you because I was going to be gone for 6 weeks, and it was way too much. I realize that now, but there was a lot of richness in it, and I was excited to share it with you. But I took it to heart, and that sermon became the kickoff for my spiritual exercise that I'm before you today to report out on. So what my yard taught me this summer. So using that list of spiritual delights from Reverend Taylor, I did the same spiritual exercise, and there are a few I'd like to share from you from my list. Number one, sitting in my lawn chair in the backyard, I do this most mornings when it's not freezing, at sunrise with my coffee, and I wait for the sun to clear the neighbor's tree and then shine on my face. Listening to a recording of my choir performing a particularly favorite piece of music. When a close friend and I are having a conversation and we're so connected that it feels like the entire world around us just stands still. And the last one is planting peonies with Aunt Evie, which I'm going to tell you about. So, going back to that sermon on June 11th, I talked about Brene Brown and Bell Hooks. Well, what do those things have in common that I just described, as well as, if you remember the list from Reverend Taylor, there's this connection at this very visceral, almost sensual level, and it's also pure joy. So connection and joy, just thinking about it, makes me feel good, brings a smile to my face. And there's this sense of belonging, which I think goes beyond just connection. Connection is, oh yeah, I remember that. Like when you hear a tune on the radio and you go, oh yeah, I remember that when I was a teenager. This is belonging. I feel like I'm transported to those people that moment, like I belong here. These are my folks, right? And then love. As I said in June, love is in every one of these. Usually it's a love of the thing, a love of the experience, or often they involve loved ones. And additionally, they're all very similar in that they're very intimate, very personal experiences. Or said another way, and now I'm borrowing Brown's wording, they occur at this micro level, not some grandiose sweeping macro level like when you go to a rock concert with thousands of people and you're having a great time. This is just very intimate. And they delight our spirits, I think, because it's so familiar. So, again, reminding you what I said, these were the concepts that Brene Brown was referring to in her blog, Doubling Down on Love, which she wrote on October 9th, 2019, or published it that day. So through her extensive research as a sociologist, Brown claims that belonging, connection, joy, and love are essential for healthy human development. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. She says our brains are basically hardwired for it. We seek it out. So all of these examples then I think naturally trigger positive and even spiritual emotions. But her blog goes further. She says doubling down on love because she gives a call to action that I think is the same call to action that Unitarian Universalism calls us to do. And I'm repeating myself from June 11th. She writes about micro and macro expressions of love and believes we live in a time where we have to do both. Remember, she wrote this at the very end of, or the October of 2019, when we were ripping ourselves apart. She cites the writings of the social critic Bell Hooks, particularly Hooks' book, All About Love, and the concept of a love ethic. Or said another way, the whole idea is to center ourselves and our values always on love. So to me that translates, whenever you're presented with any kind of a question, ethical dilemma, don't know what to do, the first question that pops into my mind is, what is the most loving thing to do at this moment? And I at least think about it. This love ethic encourages us to leverage the love we gain from spiritual delight, which is very personal, very indulgent, and leverage for good in the world. Here's a quote from Brene Brown talking about Hooks' message. Doubling down on love demands that we be brave enough to straddle the tension of staying awake to the struggle in the world and fighting for peace and justice, while also cultivating a love ethic in our own lives. We can't sacrifice the micro for the macro or the macro for the micro. Love, belonging, connection, and joy are irreducible needs for all of us. We can't give people what we don't have, and we have to live love to give love. So, in other words, and this is how I ended that sermon, we need to spend our summer seeking the spiritual delight that nurtures our love. But if we live a love ethic, we need to leverage our personal love to help heal the world. So, that's the theological point I wanted to make today, and I'm going to unpack it a bit for you for the rest of the sermon and describe this spiritual journey that I unexpectedly encountered on in my front yard this summer. So remember my short little list, the one of sitting outside and with coffee at sunrise? The last one was planting peonies with Aunt Evie. It's a little odd, so I have to explain. Now, some of you that have been around, I think a few years ago I talked about my Aunt Evie. My Aunt Evie was my mother's only sister who never married, never had kids. She was a bit quirky in her personality, but she just was very sure of what she wanted to do in life, but because of the depression and all kinds of things, she couldn't do it until 35. So at 35, she left home after her aging and ill health mother died. At 35, she went to college. And she decided she wanted to be a history teacher. She loved history. She loved everything about it. She went to a college, and then eventually she went to grad school and summer school. And she came back to this tiny little town in northern Illinois to be an 8th grade history teacher. Junior high. Who does that, right? But she was, supposedly, I'd run into my relatives in this town, and we couldn't go anywhere without people stopping and thanking her for what a wonderful teacher she was. I think she was so quirky. For example, she always wore all black on test days. She was that kind of teacher, right? And she made it come alive. She had tons and tons of props, and it was one of those old school buildings, I think built in the 60s, that had actually a glass showcase at the door to her room, and she'd set up displays that went with the lessons every time. And so apparently she was this very, very good teacher, even though she was quirky as all get out. And so this story for me talks about this tiny little town and this tiny little house that she had and this tiny little yard. And the perimeter of her backyard was completely lined with peony bushes. So that's kind of odd. You usually put marigolds or something like that, but she did peonies. The reason is in northern Illinois, peonies bloom the week before Memorial Day. And so every year she felt called to honor the ancestors. And so she didn't drink coffee, so she had to ask every friend she knew for coffee cans, or they knew that she wanted these, so they'd save them. She would line them with foil, probably 25, 30 of them. And then that week she'd go out and pick all these peonies and put them in water in these cans. And then we would drive around to every cemetery in the area where there were relatives and put these on their graves. And so my family on that side came to the US before the Civil War and settled in northern Illinois. So some of these graves, these tombstones are in German, and they're nothing more than some crossroad between soybean and cornfields out in the country. And she knew where they all were. In fact, she had done a whole family tree, and she would present at our reunions, that kind of thing. So there was this really strong connection to the ancestry and where are we from. And then when my parents got their first house, since she wasn't married and never had kids, my brother and I became her surrogate children. And so every Sunday after church, she came to our house in the next town over and spent the day with us. And so one time when my parents got their first home, she had taken peonies. I don't know how you separate peony bushes or whatever, but she'd taken them and had brought them up to our house, and we were putting a garden of peonies on the lot line in our home in the country. And I just very much remember that. And we were working in the dirt and how you had to make the dirt really loose. And there were earthworms in there. And she explained to me that earthworms are good, even though I probably was a little creeped out at the time. And, you talk to the earthworms and maybe set them aside as you're preparing the earth and put them back in. And how to care for transplanted plants, that after you get it all ready, you better put a lot of water in the bottom so the roots get really soaked and put in the dirt. How to care for the earth. So frankly, this was my first encounter with the interdependent web of all existence. I was 3 years old. So, jump forward 60 years. So this summer, I have this yard. We bought the house a couple years ago. The yard was completely neglected. It was mostly, maybe 10% grass, mostly weeds, really matted down. At some point it had lots of trees, so there's a lot of moss growing on this yard. And we wanted to do something different. I live in kind of an up-and-coming revival neighborhood in Appleton, and everyone around me does the ChemLawn thing and has the perfect lawns, and we didn't want to do that. So we decided to do this clover lawn. So it's been quite an experiment to figure out how to do this. We had somebody come and remove the sod who was interested in starting their own landscaping business and then decided that that was too much work. And so left after 3 days. And I decided, I guess I know what I'm going to be doing this summer. So again, we had to remove all the weeds and grass and everything and then plant this clover. And I've essentially been hand weeding the yard a little bit at a time. And it's actually turned into this spiritual practice for me to just be connecting with the earth. And all of these memories of my Aunt Evie and planting peonies when I was 3 have been rushing back at me. In fact, I have a lot of her garden tools that I'm using, which is really fascinating. She died about 2010 or something like that. So I'm out there, I'm working up the soil. Sometimes I'm talking to the worms. Now I live in this neighborhood where the street doesn't go anywhere. It's like it just circles round, but it circles round in a very nice looking neighborhood. So anybody that wants to go for a walk comes through my little street, especially if they're walking the dogs. So people see me out there. And I'm sitting there talking to worms. Maybe they think I'm charming, maybe think I'm a total kook, and they move to the other side of the street. I'm not quite sure. One day, a woman was walking by, and her most sarcastic voice said, "That looks like fun." And without missing a beat, I looked up and I said, "Yeah, it's like playing in a sandbox." And then she kept going on after laughing. So again, this has really, really become a spiritual practice because I enjoy it. I only can do it about an hour and a half at a time, and I don't do it every day. But it's a way for me to think about what am I doing? And I think back to that sermon, and I'm like, you told these folks you wanted them to do this, so you need to do it yourself. Um, it's given me this opportunity to literally get my hands dirty and be more contemplative about what interdependence means. So, okay, where does all this lead me? How is my inner spirit calling me in this? And frankly, okay, I'm enjoying it. I'm having a kick out of it. And I love getting something done and watching the clover come up. But what's the macro story here? You know, it was talking about leveraging things that you're delighting you into making it actionable in the world. So my mind started thinking. And it kind of went down history lane, if you will. So the present day. So where I live has a direct connection to the Fox River. In fact, until about 10 years ago, the storm sewers in my neighborhood emptied right into the Fox River. And there's a little environmental charter school nearby, and the kids would come around every spring with a stencil and spray paint. Remember, this goes into the river, and there's this little fish symbol, which was really cool to remind us not to put things there. I mean, I'm not the kind of person that would dump my motor oil down the sewer, but it's things like you're fertilizing your lawn, you're putting on weed killer, there's the sewer, here's your lawn. What do you think happens when it rains really hard? That kind of thing. So it really made me think about it. And then it's not just about the river. If you go to downtown Appleton, there's often people on the banks of the river or from the bridge that are fishing. And most of them are people of color. And I'm making an assumption here, but I look at them, they don't look like they're very well off. And I have a hunch that whatever they catch is supplementing their food sources, right? So I have to think that my extreme efforts to avoid chemicals running off my lawn are grounded in my love for people I don't even know, for their right to thrive in my world. You should be able to fish in the Fox River and eat the fish, right? Well, then my mind went even further back. I'll call it the recent past, and by recent, I'll say last 50 years. I'm reminded of all the paper companies who seriously polluted the river and the feeder lakes for decades with cancer-causing chemicals. Now, I know the story. I know that there was nothing illegal about it at the time. I know that we did not have research that showed that these were cancer-causing chemicals, so it happened. But I also know that if you're working in a company where you don't even want your hands in these chemicals, so you're wearing gloves and protective equipment, and it's going into a stream, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure out that might be a problem sometime somewhere down the road. So I think of all of that. And then I worked for one of the largest paper companies, which to my knowledge never contributed to the pollution in that serious way because we didn't make those kind of products. But generally, the industry seemed to have had a total disregard for the environment and the humans dependent on food sources from it. So I started thinking, as I'm digging in the dirt, how many people suffered illnesses and death for decades because of these hidden activities, hidden secrets? I mean, come on, if you've ever been close to anyone who's suffering from cancer, you get the slogan, "Cancer sucks." Only the cruel-hearted could turn away from such suffering. And so my filled heart went out to them with compassion for those that died. And actually, there's probably some folks who are still alive, still struggling with cancer, and hope for their recovery. So then I went even further back. Now, my neighborhood is perched, I'm about a mile from downtown. It's perched on the bluff overlooking the Fox River. And I thought, well, this is a gorgeous spot. And, you know, there must have been people for millennia that stopped here and looked down at this river. In fact, the main street into town, Prospect, from that side of town, it follows the riverbank. I have a hunch it was probably where the deer walked, and the native peoples used that as a trail to get around the river. So we weren't the first people to be there. So I went and looked it up. In 1836, the largest American Indian population in Wisconsin, the Menominee, was pressured to sell away 11,600 square miles of land along the lower Fox River. So that includes Green Bay, Kaukauna, the Fox cities, probably all the way down to Oshkosh, I'm guessing. There was a map, but it was hard to exactly see where it was. But clearly, my house sat in that land. So I thought about that. My wealth generating home, because I'm hoping that it appreciates in value and helps with my medical costs later on in life. My wealth appreciating home and the soil I'm cultivating as a spiritual practice was essentially stolen 187 years ago. How can I not love the people who also loved this land? We have this strange connection that spans over hundreds of years. But it also made me question, is this spirituality, the spiritual journey I'm on this summer, kind of blemished? Now, even though the government spent millions cleaning up the carcinogenic waste and made the river safe again, what about the generational harm caused to the unknown and the marginalized, people who didn't even register it? Essentially, I sat there one day and I thought, I have benefited directly from this white supremacist culture that existed at the time and the racist practices that were going on. And here I sit. What do I think of that? It was tough. So interdependence is one of our key values that we lift up in our seventh principle. And so this spiritual journey gave me a lot of new insight in what that seventh principle is all about. It's not just interdependent on beings next door that are downstream or downwind. I don't want the dog next door to get sick or those kind of things, which is growing up in the 70s and environmentalism, that's sort of what I think about. It's also interdependent throughout time, generations into the future, and what do I owe the past, the ancestors? What is it calling me to do as a Unitarian Universalist? What is my love ethic here calling me to do? What is the most loving thing to do? So I experimented. I'm borrowing the language contained in the proposed new version of the seventh principle, and then I've added a couple of words. It'll be obvious where I've added it. Here's what it says. I, this is my part, in partnership with my beloved congregants, covenant to cherish earth and all beings by creating and nurturing relationships of care and respect. So I think we've got this one. I don't know all of you and your personal habits, but I'm pretty sure most of us try to avoid foods raised with chemicals if we can afford it, or you raise your own. We even have a little garden out back. I think we're militant about recycling and composting. And if you look at our parking lot, I think usually fuel efficient or electric cars outnumber the other kind in almost every UU church I've ever been to. And some of the congregations, including Open Circle, have invested in putting solar panels on the roof. So I think we really get this do no harm into the future part of this principle. I think that's what we're hardwired to do, and we, I think, do a pretty good job. But there's a second part to this new principle, and this is where I'm glad they added it, because I feel like too often our seven principles, we can sit there, we're with like-minded people and go check, 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 and there wasn't very action-oriented. So the second part says, acknowledge and heal the past. Or it doesn't say that, that's my interpretation. Here's what it says. With humility and reverence, my congregants and I acknowledge our place in the web of life and try to repair harm and damaged relationships. How do you do that? What can I do? I didn't, steal their land, but now I sit there. So I think the first thing you can do is tell the untold stories. Because I started thinking about my own ancestors. They didn't leave Germany because they wanted a luxury cruise to New York and happened to stay, right? I'm peasant farmer folk, right? And somebody in one of my other congregations, when I gave this sermon, said, well, at that time, Bismarck was recruiting people for his wars, and he was recruiting males down to 9 years old. So who knows? But they didn't leave because they wanted to leave Germany and come into Illinois. So I thought about that. I would be furious if that story wasn't written down. Now, I happen to come from a white culture where things are written down and hopefully acknowledged in this case. But if it wasn't, and if my land from my ancestors was stolen away from my people, and the people that live there have no idea of what happened, that would make me very, very angry and probably depressed. So I think the first thing you can do is make sure that those stories are told. So we're honest about where we live, how that came to be. And then I thought, well, maybe you can invite those that have been wronged generations later into this world, because usually at the same time they were pushed off the land, pushed somewhere where they're out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. And I had this wacky idea that maybe the city of Appleton should ordain 1 week a year in Pierce Park, which is right next to me, Native Heritage Week, and they have a powwow or something, and the whole city is invited so that the cultures mix. I mean, you're a little different up here. You have the United Reservation, but in Appleton, it's pretty distant, far away. And then, of course, there's a lot of conversation going on in our society right now about reparations. California has been thinking about it, a lot of churches, even the UUA. There was a big debate at the General Assembly about reparations. So this is where my thoughts went this summer. So let me go back to Brene Brown. It's what she's referring to as leveraging my love into actions in this world. My spiritual journey has led me to engage deeply with the earth in my very, very own unique and quirky way. My Aunt Evie would be proud of me. And then consider how my love ethic extends beyond myself to others. As a Unitarian Universalist, my values must be centered in love. Love of myself and taking care of me. Love of the earth, the soil, the river, the land. Love of the interdependent web of all existence. Love of all of those who have been marginalized and hurt by my ancestors. Love of the richness of human diversity. I think a love of justice. Frankly, it boils down to this for me, a love of hope to live in a world where all have the opportunity to thrive. All of these are interconnected and interdependent, and all must be centered in love. I don't get to pick and choose just the easy ones. I have to wrestle with the hard ones too. So then I'm truly living into my faith, grounded in a theology of love in the center. I don't have the answers, folks. That's why it's called a spiritual journey. I don't know where this will lead me. I don't know what I'll learn and experience and love along the way. But the overarching theme of the entire program coming up this year is love at the center. So we're going to have the monthly themes, but it's all focused on love at the center. So given that theme, what does that look like? We're specifically invited to consider the new version of our Unitarian Universalist values in this context and see where it leads us. I kind of tested it out with my lawn or yard this summer, and it opened me up clearly to new spiritual paths. I'm looking forward to our journey together this year and the discoveries we will make. May all of our individual journeys be centered in love, and may we reinforce that by being in fellowship with each other here. Blessings to all of us. Ashe and amen.